You know me. Okay, well, our program tonight is discovering a 1946 letter to my grandfather and a link to the plot to assassinate Hitler. Bruce Mainzer, a native of the Chicago area, began his career as a public transit planner with the RTA and Illinois Department of Transportation before spending 35 years in the travel industry with United Airlines, Hyatt Hotels, and Norwegian Cruise Line. Now retired in Highland Park, he has served as chairman of the city's Transportation Advisory Group and co-chair of the Chicago chapter of the Climate Reality Project. In retirement, Bruce researches and presents the stories of his parents' escape from Nazi Europe, work that uncovered for the first time the story of a hero who rescued his mother and was honored posthumously in 2024 by B'nai B'rith of Jerusalem as a Jewish rescuer of the Holocaust. Bruce, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine and Nancy of the Highland Park Historical Society for inviting me and helping set up this presentation. Now, over 2 years ago, I presented the story of my mom's escape at the library, and that hour-long presentation is available on the Highland Park Historical Society's YouTube channel, and I believe Catherine has put that into the chat. In addition, all the essays I have published on my mother's and father's history is available to view on my Substack website. You see the address over there, which you can access by typing that address into your browser. Now, today I'm pleased to bring you the research I completed recently on my father's family and the family business he was supposed to take over before my father's entire family were forced to flee Nazi Germany. Now, my parents met in the Edgewater neighborhood of Chicago. My father was a German Jew who left his family at age 23 to start over in America. My mother was a Hungarian-speaking Jew who escaped Nazi-occupied Prague in 1939. They met in Chicago during my father's U.S. Army training before he deployed overseas. They decided to marry. My father died in 1991 at the age of 76, and my mother lived to nearly 104, passing away in 2022, just 1 week before her birthday. Now, my wife and I have reached that stage of life where we need to downsize. After 25 years in our home, we're getting ready to move to a condominium. And that means facing the crawl space, all those boxes and memorabilia my parents saved for decades. During the pandemic, I started going through my mother's papers, and what I found was extraordinary. It was the full story of her escape from Nazi-occupied Prague in 1939. That discovery became the subject of an essay that I published on Substack. It also became the basis for the last lecture I gave for the Historical Society and the Highland Park Library in July of 23. So after that, I was invited to speak in other places across the US and even in Israel. I was able to nominate the man who helped save my mother and aunt for a Jewish rescuer citation from B'nai B'rith. And then in 2024, I traveled to Israel to attend the ceremony awarding him that honor posthumously. For the first time, I got to meet members of his family in Israel. But at the end of 2024, another task awaited me. The boxes my father left behind when he died in 1991. I did not expect to find anything new. I certainly did not expect to uncover unknown chapters of his life as a young man in pre-war Germany. Now, that's because I had thought there was nothing more that could be revealed about my father and his family, because in the 1980s, during the last decade of his life, my father devoted himself to researching our family's deep roots in Germany, tracing them back centuries, specifically his mother's family, the Marx Cohns. He corresponded with historians and genealogists around the world. He wrote a book about the family's history. He lectured about his own experiences as a young Jewish man in 1930s Germany. So when I opened his boxes, I expected very little that was new. Most of what I found were photocopies, pages from books he had consulted in libraries in New York, Chicago, and Germany. With my siblings' permission, I began discarding the copies and keeping only his handwritten notes. I assumed this would be routine work, nothing like the revelations I had uncovered in my mother's story. And yet, file after file, I began to realize that my father's boxes contained surprises of their own. My father left Germany and landed in New York in January of 1938 at age 23 after my grandparents concluded there was no future for a young Jewish man in Nazi Germany. His younger brother, Louis, originally Ludwig, but later Louis in the US, had already left 2 years earlier. But my grandparents stayed behind in their hometown of Halle in east central Germany. They believed they could live off their savings until, quote, until the fascist government falls. My grandfather insisted this cannot last. Hitler is a clown. But on Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938, my grandfather, Hugo Mainzer, who was then chairman of the Jewish community in Halle, was arrested. His offense was refusing to give the Nazis the names of the synagogue members whom they intended to deport to Shanghai, one of the few destinations still open to Jews at that time. For that crime, he was sent to Buchenwald. Now, in the photograph in the upper right, you see prisoners arrested during Kristallnacht assembled for a roll call at Buchenwald in November of 1938. And my grandfather might just be one of those people in that picture. Now, in the lower right is his prisoner card, which I was able to download just recently from a German archive of concentration camp records. It shows that he was released, you can see there, on November 30th, 1938. So he was in Buchenwald for 3 weeks and he lost 30 pounds. Hugo was freed only on the condition that he emigrate. Now, my father tried to secure U.S. visas for his parents, but he was denied by the U.S. State Department. So instead, my grandparents, along with my father's youngest sister, 17-year-old Elizabeth, immigrated to Argentina. They were helped by a close family friend from Halle who had already fled to Buenos Aires. That family included my father's best friend, who would later marry my Aunt Elizabeth. Now, my father's family, especially on my grandmother's side, had deep roots in the German city of Halle. We can trace our ancestry there back to the 17th century, beginning in 1688, and for nearly 250 years, members of our family played a significant role in the development of the city of Halle. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, our ancestors were known as court Jews, serving as bankers, suppliers, political agents, and advisors to German and Austrian princes. Now, as I worked through the boxes my father left behind, I began finding essays he had written as a Jewish teenager in 1930s Germany. Day after day, sorting and reading became almost like having a conversation with him. I would discover his reflections on our family's past, stories of adventures from his youth, even handwritten notes suggesting which libraries or research institutions should eventually receive the documents he had collected. So I began to look forward to each day, wondering what the next file might reveal. Among the papers, I found an essay my father had written about 45 years ago on the history of the family business. That business name was called the firm of Joseph Frank, 1856 to 1938. The company was named after a great uncle of my grandfather who had no heirs. So the company eventually came under the ownership of my grandfather, Hugo Mainzer, and his brother in law, Moritz Fried. I later published that essay on Substack, and it basically tells the story of what was once the largest cattle dealing firm in Germany, and it was headquartered in Halle. After the Nuremberg laws were enacted in 1935, my father was barred from attending a German university. So instead, he joined the firm as an apprentice, working alongside his first cousin, Eric Fried, Moritz Fried's son. So the two of them were preparing to become the next part of the next generation of leadership of the firm. But in October of 1938, by decree of Hermann Göring, the firm was forced to close. And by then, my father had already emigrated to the US. Now, as I continued working through my father's boxes, I came across a folder labeled in bold black ink, Brief aus Deutschland. I don't speak German, so excuse me if I pronounce that wrong. Letters from Germany, 1946 to 1947. The handwriting was not my father's. His writing was unmistakable. He almost always labeled things in English, usually in pencil. This folder was different. Inside were roughly 24 letters, mostly handwritten, a few were typed. Some were in German, a handful in English. Using translation apps, I began to understand what they were. They were responses to letters my grandfather had written after the war, letters in which he was trying to revive the cattle business he had been forced to abandon under the Nazis. Now, the title on the folder, I realized, must have been in my grandfather's handwriting. My father once told me that his father never truly regained a sense of purpose after fleeing Germany. After my grandparents left Germany for Argentina in 1939, they lived briefly in Uruguay before finally joining their sons in Chicago in 1941. In Chicago, my grandmother quickly found work in a factory pitting cherries. But Hugo, my grandfather, still dreamed of rebuilding what had been taken from him. After the war ended, he wrote to former customers and associates in Halle, searching for any possibility of reopening the business. More than 86 years later to us now, it is painfully clear those hopes were futile. But his hometown after World War II lay in the Soviet zone of occupation, and the world he had known, the world in which our family had lived for centuries, was gone. So, because I can't read German, I turned to translation apps to uncover the voices hidden in these pages. What emerged were not just business replies, but deeply human accounts of suffering. These former clients of my grandfather described lives shattered twice over, first by the loss of family and homes in Allied bombings, and then by the relentless hardships of Soviet occupation. Now, the area in light red that you see there, or pink, is the Soviet occupation zone, and that is where Halle is. This area of Germany eventually became the GDR, or East Germany, and the land reform, communist harsh rule, and police surveillance state started with the Soviet control of this occupied area. Now, many letters I read end with simple pleas for food, as hunger was a constant presence, obviously, in Germany at that time, or in the Soviet occupation zone. So I'm going to take some time to quote from some of the letters that I think portrays the condition, the conditions in this zone. The first letter is from August of 1946. Quote, your house was miraculously spared from the bombs. Miss Bohm is still lying deep under the rubble. Many have taken their own lives. Many live impoverished in Halle. My sister arrived here with her 5 children after long transport through Germany and then died of complete exhaustion. Next letter is from May of 1947. Quote, the whole thing seems like a bad dream to me, but it is the bitter truth. The Nazi era was disastrous for the German people and led to total ruin by a man who had gone mad. One always asks oneself how it was actually possible to blind such a cultured people with lies and deception. In early October 1945, my son was arrested by the Russians without any reason, along with 14 other boys aged 13 to 16. Despite all efforts, the boys' whereabouts cannot be ascertained. The boys are accused of having formed an anti-communist group and removing posters about land reform. The liberators are concerned with destroying the intelligentsia at all costs. At the beginning of October, the land reform began, which I would describe as a revolution without weapons and with a lot of death. Most were arrested and put in camps. Some died there. You cannot even imagine what the farms look like now. The deliveries, whether in the area of grain cultivation or in livestock farming, cannot be compared to before. Only the announcer on the radio thinks it's wonderful. The dictatorship is bigger than ever, and people say it has remained the same. Nobody has a say. The food is worse than bad, but nobody is allowed to go on strike. Otherwise, they risk being deported to the East. I will just remind you of your treatment, which will probably be the greatest crime of all time. I was often accused of being friendly to the Jews when I expressed my point of view. When I drive past your home, I think of the wonderful hours I spent in the hospitable house. And here's another letter from October of 1947. Quote, Halle is no longer the same as it used to be. Would it be possible for you to support us with a loan in the form of a food package? My husband is very, very ill. Hopefully, it won't be long until everything is back on track, and then we can pay off our debt to you very soon. So it must have been a huge shock to my grandfather to just write a letter about business opportunities and receive these kinds of letters with such emotion back. So the typewritten letters were the first ones I examined. They were easier to scan and translate. After reading several, I came to one dated from May of 1946. As I began reading the translation, I froze. I remember whispering to myself, "Oh my God." I The words appeared on my phone screen using Google Translate, and I couldn't believe it. This letter was not about cattle or business. It was about a death. It informed my grandfather of the fate of one of his former clients. So I will now read the translation you see on the screen. Your letter of April 7th, 1946, addressed to District Administrator Wenzel, was forwarded to me, and I must inform you, with my deepest regret, that Mr. Wenzel is no longer among the living. He was arrested by the Gestapo a few days after the assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20th, 1944, because the Gestapo linked him to this assassination attempt. He was then sentenced to death by the People's Court and executed on December 20th, 1944. The Gestapo had long had its sights on Mr. Wenzel because of his anti-fascist views. I was also arrested at that time, but was released in April of 1945 when the Russians invaded Berlin before I was put on trial, which they would have been only too happy to do since I was also Mr. Wenzel's closest friend and confidant. In the meantime, the provisions of the land reform have expropriated all of Wenzel's agricultural and industrial property belonging to the Wenzel companies. The Wenzel family has moved away. I am pleased that you have come through the difficult times yourself and are hopefully living in satisfactory conditions. How lucky you can be that your two sons have returned from the war safe and sound. It was lucky for them that they turned their backs on Germany in time. Otherwise, they would have barely survived the Nazi era. Now, after the initial shock wore off, I began researching Carl Wenzel. I quickly discovered that he was not an obscure local figure. He was one of the most prominent agricultural industrialists in Germany during the Nazi era, the owner of vast farming, forestry, and food processing enterprises based just outside Halle at his family estate in Tuchenthal Castle. But what struck me most was not his wealth, it was his opposition to the regime. From early on, Wenzel was a determined critic of the Nazis. He maintained contact with resistance circles and repeatedly allowed meetings at the castle for individuals opposed to Hitler. Now, in November of 1943, during a dinner conversation, he made critical remarks about the regime. Those comments were reported to the Gestapo. After the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20th, 1944, Wenzel and his wife were arrested. He was tried before the Nazi People's Court. Wenzel was the only major industrialist sentenced to death in connection with the July 20th plot. He was executed on December 20th, 1944. His wife, Ella, was deported to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. After the war, she returned to Halle impoverished and died in 1949. The family's estate was confiscated. Although the Allied authorities initially overturned the Nazi verdict and expropriation, the property was seized again in 1946 under Soviet land reform. Only after German reunification in 1990 was part of the estate returned to his grandsons. So I was very stunned by what I had just read. So I went back to the other letters in the folder. And this time I was looking for specific references to Carl Wenzel. And again, I found that the writers in all of these letters in that file that my grandfather had referred to Carl Wenzel because they knew my grandfather would feel personally the loss of his friend. So it became clear that Wenzel had not been just another client. He had been central to my grandfather's business life. I then returned to the unfinished essay my father had written just 45 years ago about the history of the family firm that I mentioned before. Though it was unfinished, it was unmistakable on one point. Carl Wenzel was indeed one of my grandfather's most important customers and a close friend. My father described my grandfather's and my and Carl Wenzel's relationship as one of deep mutual respect. And as I researched further, the economic connection became clear. Wenzel's vast agricultural and food processing combined specialized in sugar production. And in the 1930s, under Nazi policies of agricultural self-sufficiency, synthetic fertilizers were diverted to military and industrial use. So that left farmers with limited access to nutrients for their fields. And sugar beets are really highly nutrient intensive. So the solution was to maintain soil fertility at the castle where the sugar beets were being grown. Wenzel relied on rented cattle supplied by my grandfather's firm, the Joseph Frank Company, to fertilize his fields. Those sugar beets were then processed into sugar at a refinery Wenzel controlled in Halle. For years, this created a close and mutually beneficial business relationship between Wenzel and the two co-owners of the cattle dealing firm, my grandfather Hugo Mainzer and my great uncle Moritz Fried. So, returning to my father's files, I searched for more references to Carl Wenzel. I quickly found a handwritten account of a story my father had first told me when I was in high school. The time Hermann Göring quoted my father's work on national German radio. And as I reread the story, I realized that Carl Wenzel was a major player in this story that I didn't know before. So here's the story my father wrote about an essay he wrote back in 1933. So I will now start reading from the essay. So this is my father's essay, just remember that. After the Nazis came to power, their first priority was the rearming of Germany. For that reason, they prohibited any outflow of German money so that they would have sufficient foreign currency to buy the raw material for rearmament. Now, the German farm economy relied heavily upon the import of soybeans as fodder for German cattle. Current restrictions were put into effect practically and immediately meat production in Germany fell. Moritz Fried realized that in a few months there would be an actual meat shortage in Germany. He asked me to help him prepare a paper showing the effect on German meat production if soybeans were not imported. We worked on the statistics for a few weeks, and I helped him write the paper. We completed the paper in early fall of 1933. One of my father's largest customers was Carl Wenzel, who owned not only large estates, but also sugar refineries and coal mines. He was a friend of Gordeler, Lord Mayor of Leipzig, a conservative with connections to Göring, who had become the economic czar of Germany. Wenzel submitted our paper to Göring. A few days later, Wenzel called to tell my father and my uncle that Göring was tremendously impressed with the logic of our paper. Wenzel assured us that this would not only result in a change of economic policy, but most probably in a change of attitudes towards Jews. In parentheses, how naive we all were. We should listen to a radio address by Göring on that matter on a given day. It was late 1933. My parents did not even have a radio at that time. When I emigrated in 1937, I gave them one as a going away present. At the given day and hour, we assembled in the living room of the Frieds to hear the good news. Göring got on the radio all right. He announced the change in policy and then went on to blast, quote, Jewish capitalists who wanted to destroy Germany by restricting import of necessary food products. My father clicked off the radio. I think it was the first time he fully recognized who the Nazis really were. So that's the end of the essay. So I just wanted to make a note. So I put a picture here of the living room of the Fried family. And just about a month ago, I reestablished contact with Moritz Fried's grandson, who lives in New Zealand. The entire Fried family escaped Germany for New Zealand. And the last time I saw my second cousin, John Fried, was in 1968. So I'm glad that I hope he's on the call right now. And he has not seen this photograph. I'm going to send the album of pictures that I found in my father's files to him in New Zealand right after this session. So, so that is the story that my father wrote. So later, I found a Nazi list of items seized from Jews in Germany in September of 1939. And on it, you can see that the Nora radio, in the third line where it says Moses Hugo Mainzer, or the third household, you can see that the Nora radio was seized from my grandparents. as well as other items taken from other Jewish homes, like precious metals and jewelry, and even mundane items like stockings, slippers, and bars of fragrant soap, as these items were forbidden to be held by Jews. Now, the second household there, under the name Moses Frank, that was my great uncle and great aunt's home. Ernestine, who is the sister of Hugo, was my great aunt, and her husband, Moses Frank. Now, you will also notice what's really interesting, that all the names on this list start with either Moses for men or Sarah for women. That is because in Germany in August 1938, it was required that all Jewish men and women carry these names, although in most of Germany it was Israel was the name for men. But it appears that in Halle, and it's the only place I've seen this in Germany, Jewish men were required by local authorities to carry the name of Moses instead. Oh, sorry, this is the radio that I should have showed. That I just picked the Nora Suntop tabletop radio that was probably that's the model that was my dad probably gave to my grandparents. Now, after rereading my father's story about Goring and reviewing the letters in my grandfather's file, I realized these documents were more than family history. They were historically significant. That realization set me on a search. I wanted to find a place where these letters could help future historians understand the human suffering in post-war Soviet occupied Germany. I began by contacting historians who specialize in post-war Germany. I emailed professors around the world. Many acknowledged the letter's importance, but none felt able to take them on. One historian in the UK wrote that the letters, quote, tell a sad story of exile and loss, repeated over time in different circumstances, and asked how anyone could ever be compensated when what they have lost, their home, their business, children, or friends, no longer exists and can no longer be restored. Still, he admitted this was not his field of research. After that, I shifted my focus. At the very least, I felt the letter describing Karl Wenzel's execution should reach his descendants. Only weeks after discovering the file, I came across this German newspaper article. Now, the article was in German, but the my browser translated it into English, and it reported on a ceremony in Halle on December 20th, 2024, the 80th anniversary of Wenzel's execution. The article included a photograph of his children. You see them standing there, and finding their names felt like a breakthrough. I tried to locate contact information for them, but I could not. So then I noticed that the ceremony had been led by this person to the far left, a fellow named Michael Wiebig, who is director of the Halle Memorial Museum. His contact details were easy to find because I could just look on the Memorial Museum site. And I emailed him. And to my surprise, he responded within hours. And he said, I've been in contact with Wenzel's grandchildren for many years. Your message will immediately enrich our work. The letters would certainly be a highlight. It would be not very nice if you could visit us when you come to Germany. So his response reassured me that these letters, not just the Wenzel letter, but the entire collection, had found the right home. So in subsequent emails, he suggested something even more meaningful, that I bring the original letters to Halle in person. And he said, quote, we could have a handover ceremony. And he wrote, the documents would be very important for us. So I began planning a trip. I asked my siblings and their spouses, including my wife, if they would join me. 7 of us will now travel together to Halle this year for this to the city where our family's story began. Now, during our first week of emailing each other back and forth, Michael Viebig and myself, one day Michael apologized for a delayed reply of not replying to me for a day. Big deal. But he explained that he had been away installing Stolperstein, which are called stumbling stones for another Jewish family. Now, these small brass plaques are set into the pavement in front of a victim's last freely chosen home. They commemorate Jews, Roma, homosexuals, political dissidents, and others who were deported, murdered, or forced into exile under the Nazi regime. The project was created in 1993 by German artist Günter Demnig. Since then, more than 100,000 Stolperstein have been placed all across Europe. So it's the world's largest decentralized memorial. Now, when I learned this, I immediately asked, could Stolperstein be installed in front of my father's family home for his younger brother Ludwig or Louis, his sister Elizabeth, and his parents? Michael responded immediately, yes. So remarkably, he had already begun arranging a Stolperstein for my great aunt, Hugo's sister, the one who lived in the same building, who perished in the Holocaust, along with plaques for the Fried family. So he proposed that all the ceremonies be held together, one day of remembrance for multiple families. He began coordinating directly with Gunter Demnig, and then I also contacted children of my father's friends and relatives from Halle who live here in Chicago, in the Chicago area, and also in Buenos Aires. So two additional families will now be honored on the same day when we go out there. And the entire effort is being organized by an organization called Zeitgeschichte in Halle, which stands for Living or Contemporary History. It's an association dedicated to preserving the memory and history of Germany and the Jews. Each Stolperstein dedication is accompanied by school and youth projects, ensuring that the stories of these families are not only remembered, but studied, discussed, and passed forward. So, about a month after my first exchange with Michael Viebig, the director of the Memorial Museum, I received an email from the descendants of Karl Wenzel, and they invited our family to stay at their castle in Tuchenthal, just outside Halle, during our visit. So today it operates as a resort, but it is very likely the same home where my grandfather once dined with his close business associate, Karl Wenzel, before his arrest and execution and before my family had to leave and some of my families perished. So to return there now feels very significant. So Stolperstein will soon be installed in front of this apartment building in Halle. This building was purchased in 1914 by my grandfather, Hugo Mainzer, and his brother-in-law and business partner, Moritz Fried. This is where my father lived with his brother, Louis, his sister Elizabeth, and his parents, obviously, Hugo and Herta, until they were forced to leave Germany. Now, for years, we had visited this building on certain number of trips we made out there without ever having a photograph of it from the past. I was there with my father in 1990. My younger brother and sister had stood there with my parents in 1976. But only 2 months ago, I finally found this picture in my grandfather's files. So today, this is a picture of the building from Google Maps. And you can see it still stands as an apartment house with a nice paint job, with the exception that the large second floor apartment where the Mainzers once lived is now occupied by a law firm office. And so the brass plaques will be placed directly in front of that entrance. Now, Recently, I saw on TV a news story out of Minneapolis. It was about an immigration officer, an ICE officer, mocking a man who was simply trying to deliver medicine to his detained father in a detention center. And when I saw that, I immediately thought of something my own father once described. Back in 1981, he gave an interview on Chicago Public Television, and I only discovered that videotape recently, tucked away in a box among his papers. My brother told me that my father never liked that recording. He thought his German accent was way too strong. He had arrived in America in 1938, and he was completely American, but he never lost that accent. And because of that, he more or less hid the videotape until I found it 44 years later. So the 5 minute clip you're about to see comes from that interview. In it, my father describes a final encounter with a Gestapo officer inside this very apartment in 1937, just before he emigrated to the United States. And there's one small detail I want to explain before you see the video. When my dad refers to his elderly aunt in the video, he's talking about his Aunt Ernestine, my great aunt, who lived in the same building. Remember the second household where the radios were taken from. It was in 1943, my Aunt Ernestine was deported to Theresienstadt, where she was murdered. So this video feels like the right way to end this presentation.
Forward in time a little bit, during the later years after 1935, after the racial laws, the Nuremberg laws were enacted, the pressure on the Jews became stronger and stronger. And we had more dealings with the Gestapo for one reason or another. You needed permits, you needed all kinds of things, and also the pressure on us became greater by frequent imprisonments. For example, I had an aunt who was the local leader of the Jewish Women's League. And she was an elderly lady. And one day, for one reason or another, she was imprisoned. And she had angina. So I tried to bring her medicine. And there was a young Gestapo officer who was not much older than I was, maybe 4 or 5 years older. And he was apparently in charge of our family. And he said to me, you don't need that medicine. That old Jew, that Jewish pig is going to croak one way or another, with or without medicine. Well, we had a little argument about this point. And so we were acquainted, we knew each other. Now, when I came to the point of emigration, 1937, I needed a permit to take along cash in the tremendous amount of 10 marks, which was equivalent to about $4.20.
$4.20.
For that amount, I needed a permit from the Gestapo. So I went to see this particular man, and he started a long tirade about the viciousness of the Jews and the bloodsuckers, the thieves. I always was very sensitive on points which came to my family, and I blew up. I started screaming at him and started calling him names and told him that I wished him the worst things in life, but I couldn't think of wishing him anything worse than going to a foreign country with $4.20 in his pocket.
Oh.
After that, I went home, and I had second thoughts because I thought he would not take it and would finally come to arrest me. Well, nothing happened for a few days, and then the day before I had to leave, or wanted to leave, there was a lot of commotion in our home because my father, in the meantime, had been forced to sell part of his business to liquidate other parts. There were a lot of officials, a lot of Gestapo agents, a lot of police in our house at that day. And our old maid came to me and said that this young Gestapo agent wanted to see me. And I naturally thought he had come to arrest me. And when I went downstairs to see him, he was not in uniform, which kind of surprised me. He was in civilian clothes. And he asked me if I could be alone with him in a private office. So I took him to a small office, and he started out the conversation by telling me that if one word of that conversation would go out, my parents would not live. And I told him that whatever was said in this room between us would be between us. Then he sat down and he looked at me and he said, I want to tell you that you are the lucky one.
Oh,
you are leaving. You are going to a country where there's progress, there's freedom, and he started talking about America. He said, and I'm staying here. And what we are doing is madness. It must end in a catastrophe. It must end in hell. I think that's what the university used. He used the word hell. And I looked at him and I said, if you feel that way, why are you a Nazi? And he said to me, don't you understand? He said, I'm the son of a miner. What else, where else could I be a big shot? This is my opportunity. And as long as it lasts, I will sail it, I will take advantage of it, but I know where it will end.
So thank you very much for listening and honoring my family's memory. I will take questions, and I believe that Catherine will forward the questions to me by what you put into the chat or the Q&A. So again, thank you very much, and we'll just spend some time answering some questions.
Shelley Payson said, this was wonderful. Thank you for sharing these stories about your family. Don Robbins said, such amazing research and a very compelling presentation. Thank you, Bruce. Really, it's quite true. But we'd also like a question.
Yeah.
Because what you're saying is quite reasonable. Because Bruce will get all of these. By the way, Bruce, what do you think is the next project? Or
I
that
don't
hasn't
know.
dropped in your lap yet?
I don't know. I've run out of parents. My
Yeah.
wife's telling me I have to do her family now.
Well, that's not a bad idea. Come on, somebody has a question. I know. When was the cutoff time for Jews to no longer leave Germany?
It was probably about 1940 when the war started. All the borders basically closed up at that time. So one of the interesting thing about European Jewry is I believe German the German Jewish population was about 500,000 Jews, and half of the Jews in Germany were able to emigrate. So, but that's unlike what happened in Poland, Russia, Czechoslovakia, other countries, because once those countries were taken over in war and occupation, there was no way out.
But it wasn't always easy to find that place to go to.
Exactly. So, in fact, one of the families that we're going with to Halle, who live in the Chicago area, their parents went to Shanghai. They were from Halle and they went to Shanghai, and they will be coming with us to the ceremonies in Halle.
Somebody inquired, how long did it take you to research your mom's story? And I think your dad's as well.
Okay, so the question is how long? Well, my mother's research took a long time because my mother had Alzheimer's and uh, everybody had passed away, so I had to rely on documents, and there were a lot of questions. And so that research project was very different from my father's research project, because as I mentioned, um, for my mother, I had to consult with the U.S. Holocaust Museum, professors and people around the world to just figure out what happened in Prague. With my father, it was just a matter of going through boxes because my father documented everything. So, for example, the story of the cattle dealing firm was very detailed, and that essay that my father wrote is on the Substack website. So it was just a matter of going through the boxes. I didn't have to call or go to libraries or anything.
Thank you again for the fantastic work. Perhaps I missed this. Was Wenzel involved with the failed plans to assassinate Hitler?
Yes, I believe there were a few attempts. So this this attempt was probably the last attempt. It was July 20th, 1944. I don't believe it was the attempt that was really famous with the bomb that was placed under the table. I think that was an earlier attempt on Hitler. And Wenzel was involved in meetings of the resistance, although there's no documentation that he was ever involved in the specific mechanics of the plot. But he was still arrested and executed.
Bruce, who do you expect from the Wenzel side will attend the handoff ceremony in Halle?
I'm not sure about that, but I think his someone who's married to his great grandson is now running uh, running the hotel.
Have you had some of these families that you've found this information not want to make contact with you?
Yes, there was one family who didn't, and a lot depended upon the views expressed by the people who left about Germany. So, one family, they're distant cousins from us. When they left, they said they didn't want anything to do with Germany. Um, and so when I contacted their grandchildren, they said we need to honor the last, their wishes, and they didn't want anything to do with it. So they're not coming. But for my father, I had gone with him on a trip in 1990 to Germany. And when we started the trip, he was like he always was. He didn't want to have much to do with Germans or Germany. And we were on a train towards the end of the trip, and I found him um, enjoying himself talking to uh, other people on the train, especially young people. And I hit him in the side and I said, Dad, it looks like, and I didn't know what he was saying because I don't speak German, but I said, it looks like you're having really good conversations with people. Are you enjoying yourself? And he said, Yes, I am. I think these are good people. And I said, Really? How could you say that? He said, Because everybody in my generation is dead. And then he passed away 6 months later. But that helped me realize that, um, you know, there
Sorry.
there was an opportunity to do this.
Do this right. Um, was Halle a target for any bombing in World War II?
Yes, it was
Mhm.
really a target, and in fact, the neighborhood around my father's apartment was heavily bombed so badly that it was one of the only buildings left standing in that area. Um, And in the story is in 1976, when my younger brother and younger sister accompanied my parents to see it, they knocked on the door, and my father asked in German, "Why is this house still here?" He was playing coy. He wasn't going to admit that he used to live there. And the people in the apartment said, "Oh, Jews used to live here." And they say that they got their last revenge on the town when all the other buildings were bombed by the Allies, and this one was the only one standing. I see Kim has asked, "Where's the background scene?" That's Halle in a depiction of Halle in 1900, the downtown of Halle.
In fact, in your other presentation, I hope you don't mind, but you went to a lot of effort to figure out where your mother and your uncle and her sister, where they were at one point in their life, and you studied a lot of, I think, Google street views.
Right,
You're
right.
very impressive with the research, you know?
I'm obsessed.
It's okay. This is a good one. Are there any more questions? Oh, it looks like there is. Oh, why don't you talk a little bit about the Nazi policy in Hungary concerning the Jews and how that affected our mom's family, Bruce's brother?
Well, this is about our dad. So um, save it for the lecture on my mom.
If I might interject, I don't know about Bruce's family. I know more now from listening to him. Um, Hungary remained independent until the very end of the war. But nevertheless, at the end of the war, when Nazis did collude with the Iron Cross, they had an intense effort to have continue their work persecuting the Jewish families in Hungary. And but the policy was the same, the extent of the laws. However, it happened much later than in other parts of Europe.
Right.
Yeah.
What happened was that even though there was a fascist regime in both Hungary and Slovakia, they weren't occupied by Nazi troops. So even though they passed um, anti-Semitic laws and Jews weren't allowed to do a lot of things, they didn't deport them to death camps. But after D-Day, uh, the resistance movements in both Hungary and Slovakia started to have some success, and Hitler got worried. So he sent troops there. And when he sent the troops, they realized, wait, you didn't send the Jews to concentration camps. So all almost 90% of the Hungarian Jews were murdered in Auschwitz after D-Day in the last year of the war. That's what's so sad.
Timing is everything,
All right.
unfortunately. Well, if there's no more questions, Bruce, this was, oh, somebody said, oh, thank you, Bruce. This is terrific. Incredible research. I think we all agree on all that.
Well,
This
it's kind of biased because these are family members that are complimenting me.
That's not too bad. My family usually points out what mistake I made.
Well, I would like to compliment Bruce as well. Excellent research, excellent work with the archives, whether it's geographic or family or historical research. It's wonderful to share this with us. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks. Thanks again.
And happy Passover,
Thank
if that's the right way to put it.
April 1st.
Yeah, I know, but it's nearby.
It's
Okay,
Purim
thank
coming
you.
up.
All right, Bruce, thank you so much. And let me know when you're ready to do it again.
All right.
All
Thanks.
right, be
Take
good.
care.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye bye.